Hey guys, it's Shaylin. I'm here today with another episode of Recent Reads. This is the series where I just chat about the last 10 books that I read. I love making these videos because I love just chatting about the books that I read. I read a lot of books and I like to just take the chance to just quickly share my thoughts on stuff that I've read recently, both to recommend the books that I liked and also just reflect and just like take an hour every couple months to just like really reflect on everything I've read and how I felt about it and why I felt the way I felt about it. As always, necessary disclaimer, not that people actually don't understand this, I just feel the need to say this is just my subjective opinion. And the beauty of literature is that different people will feel different ways about books because we all have our own tastes and lived experiences that we take into the books that we read. The first book that I read was Animal by Lisa Taddeo. This book follows a woman named Joan who is having an affair with this man who's married, and while she's out with him, another man that she's had an affair with shows up and kills himself in front of her. After that, she's basically, you know what? Screw this. I'm running away to LA, and she's in search of someone important from her past or her life that we're not exactly sure why this person is important. I have mixed feelings on this book. I think in many ways it's really well done. I don't think it was marketed super well because the way it was marketed to me seemed like a very different story than what we got. It's kind of marketed as like a story of like female rage. I'm taking revenge on all the men who have wronged me. We stand. But that wasn't really the plot of this book. This is more this one woman recounting the many traumas she has experienced, and there isn't really catharsis. The writing is so punchy. It's really electric. I don't know, it just felt like trauma, shock, over and over and over. The last scene, which I don't know, it was genuinely moving, though maybe a little too open-ended for a book, which was just so thick with violence towards this character. This book is also told in an address, so there's a you character that the book is addressed to, and we don't find out until quite late in the book who this address is. The address in this book does not fit the book's tone. This book is so gritty and raw and violent, brutal, and I don't think it matches who she's speaking to. I think in the end, this is a really interesting character portrait, and, you know, it kind of slowly reveals the different traumatic events that Joan has experienced at the hands of various men in her life. And I do think it's a better book than my rating reflects. I do think it's well conceptualized and well written and well put together. I think I found it very hard to enjoy because to me there wasn't really enough emotional texture to feel any kind of catharsis, and at a certain point you almost get numbed to the amount of trauma happening because it's just constant. In a sense, that is also how the character feels. I guess usually when I say I enjoyed a book, I mean like it moved me. It stirred something in me. It made me feel something. And I think that this book almost made me shut down emotionally because it was so brutal with no real emotional texture. So then I read a sci-fi book, little different from me, Light from Uncommon Stars by Ryka Aoki. I read this for a book club that I'm in with some coworkers. It was actually on my TBR and I was planning on reading it very soon. Don't you love it when the book club pick is a book that you were about to read anyways? This book follows several characters. The first character, Katrina, is a violinist who runs away from home and she meets this violin teacher named Shizuka, and she is caught in a Faustian bargain where she has to deliver the souls of 7 violin prodigies to hell in order to escape damnation. So when she meets Katrina and she sees that Katrina is an extremely gifted violinist, even though she's never really had technical training, she takes Katrina on as her last protege. And then we also follow this other character, Lon, who is a alien escaping like an apocalypse from an alien world and staying in a spaceship disguised as a donut shop. This is one of those books where there's a lot that I really admire about it, but there are some things that I guess they weren't choices that I would have made. First of all, I just want to talk about the style. So this is told in an omniscient POV, but every time there's a POV shift, we change scene. But the scenes are extremely short, so we will change point of view and have like 4 scene breaks on a single page, And sometimes it's pointless. We'll be in a conversation, so it's mostly dialogue. There's barely any narrative, but there's still like 4 POV shifts. It just felt like jarring, and it made it really hard to settle into the scenes, and the points where I felt the most in this book are when we could settle into a point of view for longer, because these are interesting characters. Like Katrina especially, but also Shizuka, those 2 characters are both really interesting, and I wanted to just like settle into their psychologies, but most of the time it was a very fragmented style. To me, the alien thing didn't work. There's a whole plotline with the alien donut shop, to me, didn't fit organically with the Faustian Bargain violin prodigy storyline, which is so interesting on its own. It doesn't need another element. Another element to me made it feel cluttered, and it was too silly for the book's themes and topics. It just kind of, to me, overcrowded the book with an unnecessary element that ultimately felt tonally off balance and only seemed present to have kind of a deus ex machina in the ending. This might be the only time that I will ever say the book could have done without the sapphic romance, because we get a romance between Lon, the alien donut shop owner, and Shizuka, the violin teacher. To me, I just felt that this whole plotline with the aliens felt so out of tone, and it shifted the book's tone in a really silly direction that I don't think worked with the inherently like really heavy topics that the book is also exploring. In one paragraph, you'll have Katrina being like, yeah, so here's some horrible abuse that I face. And then in the next paragraph, it's like, tee, I'm an alien who lives in a spaceship donut shop. I'm not trying to say that trans stories or queer stories in general can't have silliness or humor or levity. In fact, they absolutely can. There were some beautiful moments of levity in Katrina's own story. The reason I don't think it worked for me is that this tonal silliness isn't happening in Katrina's storyline, where the depictions of abuse and transphobia are happening. They're in another storyline that she doesn't really interact with that much. So we're, as the audience, we're cutting between, like, an abuse narrative at some points. Not always. I don't think it was like gratuitous or anything. But, you know, Katrina's storyline has some really heavy topics, and we're cutting between this storyline, which even then, beyond the, like, real heavy topics, like abuse and transphobia, there's still, like, this whole thing about Faustian bargains and demons and literal hell. And then we're cutting to this, like, really silly donut shop storyline with other characters. And so it just kind of felt like tonal whiplash to me. There was a lot I admired about this. It was really creative. One of the most creative books I've read. It's so quirky, it's charming, it's whimsical, it's really full of heart. I think it was just a little disjointed. I really liked the way that transness and queerness was explored in this book, because I thought it was a really beautiful, fresh angle how that Katrina's transness was something that made her musically gifted. I really liked that her trans identity was art and music and beauty. It wasn't like, oh my god, how she overcame being trans to be a prodigious violin player. This was like, no, she's a prodigious violin player in part because she's trans. I think that the book was just too cluttered. It just took away from what was, at its heart, a really charming, beautiful narrative about trans identity and music and connection. This will find the right reader. So then I read What We All Long For by Dionne Brand. This is like a duo copy of 2 Dionne Brand novels. So What We All Long For is a very quiet portrait of 4 young people who live in Toronto. It's about love, it's about being an immigrant, it's about family. And we just follow these 4 characters and their connections and relationships with each other as well as with their family. It's a very quiet, poignant portrait of these 4 people. It's very slice of life. The ignition of the story is more of a promise of what will happen at the end than like anything that happens at the beginning. We kind of just encounter these 4 characters plus one other character who is a bit separate from them, but also like clearly connected. Tuyen, one of the main characters, her parents were boat refugees in the Vietnam War. She was born after her parents landed in Canada, but when they were escaping Vietnam, as they were getting on the boat, they lost her brother, who was really young. There are sections that are told from his perspective, starting all the way when he was first separated from the family leading up to now. So the book doesn't really ignite in the fictive present in a way that any of the characters are aware of, but we know as the reader that there's this veering together. There's 4 really distinct but subtle protagonists here, but I think what's most interesting is actually their web of interpersonal connections. Like, they're all interesting characters on their own, but they're made more interesting through their relationships. That's really the most fascinating part, is these 4 characters and their very realistically messy relationships that they have with each other. At its core, this is a story about unrequited love, both romantic and also familial. In many ways, you kind of spend the whole book waiting for an ending that you've anticipated from the very start, but almost feels too intense when you actually get there for how quiet and subtle this book is. The book has such a delicate touch. It's so slice of life. There's this impending conclusion that you know about, but the characters don't, so it's not like there's really that much tension because you know it's coming from the beginning, and when it actually happens, I think it was too intense for how delicate the rest of the story was. I felt more tension in the relationships between the 4 characters than Key, the brothers' return, but the writing's beautiful, smooth, it's really easy to read, but really well attuned, and really just like delicate, realistic feeling book about 4 well-drawn characters. Now the book that I have the most thoughts on, I think this is one of the most talked about books of the year, and it's Lapvona by Ottessa Moshfegh. I love Ottessa Moshfegh's work. Since Death in Her Hands wasn't my favorite, I was like, Ottessa, this is your comeback moment. And then I started seeing everyone has very strong but differing opinions on this. This book is set in a medieval village called Lapvona. We follow a bunch of characters in this village, specifically Marek, the son of the village shepherd, and it's just honestly quite a grotesque, deranged, disgusting book. But it's also like haunting. There's a strangely compelling quality to this book, and it comes from how nonchalantly the characters exist through such depravity. The grossness never ends. It is a constant array of horrors and grossness and abuse and disgustingness. And there are some, frankly, shocking moments. It's shocking to us, but to the characters, it is just life. It is every day. The narrative delivers these things as if it's not shocking at all. So everything feels almost detached. They almost don't feel like characters, like real characters. It's almost like you're watching like a play, a set. I don't know, I left this book very thankful that I did not live in medieval times, I can tell you that. All the Litfic girlies are in their medieval phase, because Lauren Groff gave us a medieval book, Ottessa Moshfegh gave us a medieval book. As soon as like Anne Patchett or someone drops a medieval book, I will have absolutely no choice but to get a master's degree because that thesis writes itself. I left this book feeling somewhat empty and apathetic to its characters. Like, despite the horrors they went through, it didn't really make me feel much in the end. I think the characters feel like they're living in this, like, strange, deranged fairy tale. And in some ways it works. And it kind of plays oddly well for dark comedy, but it doesn't really leave you caring about the players. Something that I think worked better in Ottessa's other novels is that they're so intimate that they kind of force you to relate to people that you don't really want to relate to. This book doesn't really force you to relate to the characters. You can kind of just witness them. There is something very alluring and haunting and that I found very compelling while I was reading about, like, the spiritual apathy in this book. Like, the characters are facing just this, like, primal brutality every single day. Everything has been stripped back for them. It's like human nature at its most bare. But if this is human nature at its most bare, I don't know if I have any faith in human nature left, you know? I have a lot to say about this book. This is going to be the longest section of the video. I'm going to get a little into, like, the Ottessa Moshfegh meta. The Moshfegh meta, let's call this. Her other work had this, like, framework of psychological study behind it to support the disgust and to give it purpose. Does this book have a framework to support its disgust, or is it just disgust for the sake of disgust? That's something that I'm still asking myself, I guess. Do I think it's wrong that the book has disgusting content? No. Am I sure what the disgust is being used for, other than just to get the reaction? You know, like, it's certainly getting a reaction. A lot of people are offended by this book and how gross it is. I'm not offended by it. I guess I'm just asking what's under the surface. What is this disgust saying? Is it saying that this is truly what human nature is at its most bare? And do I agree with that? Because I think Moshfegh is at her best when she can tone in on the horrific, disgusting nature of a single person. Then the work inherently feels like it has a purpose. We're dissecting this person's psyche. That's what's so good about Eileen and R&R. And for those who enjoy Death in Her Hands and McGlue, I think you could find the same quality in those books. I just didn't enjoy them as much for other reasons. She forces you into uncomfortable intimacy with her narrators. I don't think that really translates as well to a book that's about a society. It feels too thematic. I don't really know what to take away from this book because it feels very on the nose in the sense that, like, you know, Lapvona is a small, blatant reflection of, you know, things like class inequality but with all the complications of modern society stripped back. Moshfegh always says her work is not political. Like, I'm not saying your work has to be political. Your work can be about whatever you want, and there has to be room for work with all types of different purposes. But in this specific case, I don't know if this isn't political, like, what's the goal? You can take away almost obvious, or I would even say overly simplified, parallels between modern society and the world of the book. But if they weren't intended, like, what was intended? I don't know. Like, I'm not trying to critique the book for its intention, but I'm just kind of talking in the meta at this point from what I know about Ottessa Moshfegh and her literary intentions. Because to me, what I know of her literary intentions kind of supports the fact that I left this book feeling a bit empty in terms of what I was supposed to take away. I don't know. Like, to me, I wasn't surprised. From having read all of her work, I wasn't surprised by the content. I just have questions about what is underneath the disgust. I have no problem with the disgustingness in this book. Maybe it's her most disgusting book, but in some ways you're a bit more detached from it, so it almost doesn't hit as much. My question about the book isn't if the disgust is wrong, it's what's underneath the disgust. The breadth of this book doesn't force you into that, like, microscopically focused perspective, and so instead you just have all these horrible people that kind of just feel like puppets in this, like, deranged parable. Okay, this is my last point. I'm sorry I'm reading from my notes a lot. I took so many notes on this book. I think a lot of the issue with this book and its reception comes down to this. Moshfegh says her work is not political, which is fine. There isn't one reason people can write, and if she writes to psychologically examine characters in completely amoral spheres, that's fine. With Lapvona, it inherently feels like a narrative that should be political because it's about a society. Like, I don't know, can you write a book that's making statements about society and how the base nature of humanity contributes to the corruption of society and say, like, no, that's not political? You know, her prior work was about the individual. This one is about the society. So if we're taking her word that her work is not political, it kind of leaves you asking, okay, well, what is this saying? The obvious takeaways are almost so obvious that they don't feel deep. It's like, yeah, class inequality exists. The poor get exploited by the upper class. Okay, like, Ottessa, I can look outside and see that. This just feels like a premise that is impossible to write in an apolitical way. You know, so we get, like, an inherently political concept written by an author who says, I don't write about politics. So what's left? So is it truly just a deranged parable with no statements to be drawn about society? The more I talk about this book, the less I like it. I originally rated it 4 stars because I hadn't really thought about it deeply. Like, I was like, okay, 4 stars. It wasn't my favorite, but it was weirdly compelling. The more I sit with it, the more I'm like, I almost have nothing to sit with. This is a weird one, and I think it's one that everyone has very different reactions to. So if you've read Lapvona, I really want to hear what you think about it, because, again, not that I think that this reaction that I have is right. That's just my analysis of this very controversial book. Then I read the last 2 books in the Live Ship Traders trilogy by Robin Hobb, The Mad Ship, Book 2, and Ship of Destiny, which is Book 3. So this series is a series that my brother made me read, but, like, it was a good pick. So this series is a trilogy that is the second trilogy in a series of 16 books, which is made up of, like, multiple different intersecting series. This particular trilogy follows the Vestrit family. They are traders of Bingtown, which are families who use these ships called live ships made of wizard wood, which is magical wood, which quickens or comes alive if 3 generations of a family live and die on the decks. We follow multiple generations of the women in this family, as well as quite a few other characters. There are actually a lot of POVs in this book. There are sea serpent POVs. There are boat POVs. There's a pirate lord POV, and then you get a lot of perspectives of the characters from this family. You know, the more I read this series, the more I really enjoyed it. I really liked book 1. I think I gave it a 4 out of 5, and I think I even said in my review, I think I will like the later 2 books even more because I will be acquainted with the world. You know, I liked each book even more than the previous book, because I do think they're, like, extremely consistent quality. I think it's just the longer I read, the more invested I got. The character work here is so fantastic in both books. Just really deep characters. The depiction of trauma rings almost more true than in more realistic works. The character work is just fantastic. There are boats that have realistic, full-drawn character arcs that are better than you see with a lot of human characters. Like, it's really, really well done. I thought the ending provided a really perfect mix of satisfying twists that you didn't see coming and really satisfying resolution for threads that you've anticipated would merge for, like, a very long time. One thing that my brother said this, because he's a huge fan of the series, and I'll actually link his review of the books, and he has a really in-depth review of the series that is spoiler free. One thing that I remember him saying that he really likes about this book, and once he said it, I was like, oh yeah, is that you truly always feel that everything could go wrong at any possible moment, and the status quo is never safe. And it does go wrong, and the consequences are so deep and so lasting. I don't know, she toes the line between, like, honesty and brutality and, like, sensitivity to the subject matter in a way that I think is very hard to do. The world doesn't feel sanitized, but it also doesn't feel gratuitous. And I think that that's a very difficult line to toe when you're talking about really difficult topics. I think she's managed to find the balance between what is necessary and what is sensitive. She's very good at character writing, and it pays off in how she writes her themes. And then I read Daughters of the Deer by Danielle. This book is set in the 17th century. We follow an Algonquin woman who is married off to a French fur trader. And then in the second half of the book, we follow her daughter, who is a two-spirit, and she's in love with this other girl. But of course, the French colonizers are like, being gay is truly the worst thing of all time. This was really beautiful and quick and light and smooth and gentle, but still, like, really enthralling. I do wish there was a little more detail given to Jean and Josephine's relationships. I just wanted a little more detail to that. Like, they're in love. There are huge emotional stakes to this relationship, but we only really see them interact a few times. We don't really know how they met. We don't even really know any of Josephine's personality traits. What does Jean love about her so much, you know? It's like I felt the love between them when they interacted on the page, but I didn't really know any of the context behind that. And I think it would have made that relationship a lot more impactful. Also, just some of the dialogue is weirdly modern in this book. Like, most of the book is written in what I would call, like, a neutral voice. So it's neither historical nor modern. It just feels neutral. Every so often, they're just, like, really modern phrasings. I think the themes in this book are very blatant, and the writing is quite, like, upfront. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. This felt like a very clear, like, upfront exploration of these topics, but maybe that's good. Like, maybe that's necessary sometimes, you know, it's not subtle, but maybe with topics as important or as discussed in this book, maybe, like, it doesn't always need to be subtle. Maybe sometimes there are things that just need to be said and not masked or hidden, buried in a way that they will only be interpreted by those who are already educated on the topics, and probably misinterpreted or missed by those who are ignorant to them. Like, it's very easy to read, and I think still really compelling, interesting story. Then I read Cherry Beach by Laura McPhee-Browne. This book follows two friends, Ness and Hetty, who move from Australia to Toronto. Ness is in love with Hetty and has been for a really long time. Hetty is coming out of, like, a toxic relationship where her boyfriend had committed suicide, and so they kind of moved to Toronto together, and Ness is trying to figure out how she can, like, establish and have other relationships and a sense of self while being in love with her best friend, and Hetty is having kind of like a emotional breakdown. This is a very slice of life book, and it's quite interesting even when nothing is happening. I read the first, like, 2/3 of this just in one sitting, and, like, nothing really happened, but I still really enjoyed it. It's, like, really gentle. There's no plot whatsoever, but I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm at the same, like, stage of life kind of as these characters, so it felt really relatable, and the emotions felt really relatable. I just thought that the characters were a little half-baked. Like, there were a lot of opportunities that we could have taken to learn more about them, but they weren't taken. In this same amount of space, I could have had a deeper portrait of the characters, but some of those opportunities were not taken. Then I read some poetry. Waiting for Frank Ocean in Cairo by Hazem. Fahmy interweaves Frank Ocean lyrics into poetic accounts of this author's life. I just thought that that was really interesting when work uses other work as form. I think these poems are very skilled at, like, haunting you in the unsaid. No, did I not tab it? Oh, I had a perfect example of this, and now I don't remember which poem it was in. Points where the poems will kind of, like, tease you with an answer, but just not say it. I think what this collection maybe lacked for me was imagery to juxtapose the amount of internal reflection. Like, this is a collection that is greatly about a person's identity shifting across places, different places. And that just felt like a bit of a missed opportunity, because it's like we were missing, these are, like, place identity poems, but we were missing the place aspect. So for poems that are about finding identity in relation to or outside of the spaces we inhabit, we kind of get the identity but not the place. It's a very impressively accessible collection because it feels very accessible without ever feeling reductionistic or simplistic. Some poetry is so accessible that I'm like, this was just simplified and not very interesting. This is really accessible and easy to read and easy to understand and easy to digest, but it doesn't sacrifice nuance to do that. Then I read A Certain Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers. So this book follows a food critic named Dorothy who starts killing men and eating them. It is her writing her memoir from prison. Some of the writing is unreal. Like, there are just some, it's a very dense, to use a bit of a on-the-nose word, voracious voice. The character is really, in many ways, fascinating. I did think that we kind of learned, like, the most interesting things there were to learn about her near to the beginning. We keep learning things about her throughout the book, like, she's a really complex character, but the most crucial things about her we learn at the beginning. It's not that she's shallow, she's wildly complex, but she's not really subtle. She's not the kind of character that we need to, like, slowly unpack and slowly unweave throughout a book. She's like a really over-the-top yet believable character. I just thought the linearity was a bit odd. We kind of know what happens and where it's going from the very start. So at a certain point it starts to get a bit repetitive to the middle. It's just like, okay, yeah, this is the guy she kills and how she gets away with it and how she eats them. This is the next guy she killed, how she gets away with it and how she eats them. From the very beginning, we already know where she eventually ends up, which murder it was that lands her in prison, how her best friend ends up betraying her, all of the men she's killed. I see how it works with it being like a memoir, but like at the same time, this is also a piece of fiction. Wild book. The last book that I read was the other Dionne Brand novel, Love Enough. In many ways, this is very similar conceptually to what we all long for, but it plays out quite differently. It's also just about 4 different people in Toronto. We kind of just follow them separately, and it's much briefer and more impressionistic. There isn't really a cohesive narrative. It's a very short book, so it's very impressionistic. It kind of feels like you're just watching 4 short films, like, intercut. So you get these, like, really intimate, fleeting, but important little moments. I think the characters are deeper and richer in what we all long for. I really liked the lightness and brevity of Love Enough because I do really enjoy that style, and I liked how these moments could feel so particular but so important while just being, like, so brief. The moments almost just spoke for themselves outside of a narrative. They're both beautifully, clearly written. She has a really easy, fast, but, like, rich prose style. Like, I don't know, it's quite exceptional how perceptive and descriptive her prose manages to be while reading so fast and so smooth. That is all for today's recent reads video. As always, I just want to know what you guys have been reading lately. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.